Good afternoon, everyone. It's 4 o'clock, so we're going to get started. We are pleased to have you all join us for this webinar, Funding Assistive Technology, K-12. We're pleased to welcome Chris Gibbons, VP of Education and Assessment for SmartBox, Inc. We do want to hear from you. At the end of the webinar, please fill out our brief survey, and you can get a certificate of participation for the webinar. I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Chris, and he can get started. Thanks.
Thanks very much. I want to say hello to everybody that's here this fine afternoon. Please note that I'm calling in from cell phone today because out here in the beautiful Pacific Northwest we had what is now being termed Snowmageddon, and we're not used to white frozen stuff falling from the sky. We're used to it being very wet out here instead. So no one knows quite what to do, and it means that I'm calling from a remote location. If I drop the call, I promise I'll call right back. Just want to let everybody know that I am a real person. I always try to include a little bit of personality when I'm doing these kinds of presentations. And last night I was playing guitar with our oldest, so snapped a quick photo to make sure that you know that our lives are all bigger than what we do, even though what we do drives our life. And so like all of you here, I'm intensely interested in what happens with assistive technology for people with disabilities, and really for all of us, because we all learn from each other. So I just want to thank everybody for being here. As a disclaimer, I will say that I work for SmartBox, as has already been established, and at SmartBox we design and manufacture software for augmented communication and for access to environmental controls and a bunch of other stuff. I said it as a disclaimer just so you make sure that if I say anything and you think, well, where's he coming from? That's where I'm coming from, even though I'd like to think I'm not coming from there. We all come from where we work. So now you know that part too. So today we are going to discuss assistive technology and funding. And I think importantly, as an umbrella just sort of conversation about assistive technology, it's important to revisit frequently how much the landscape of assistive technology worldwide has changed in just the last decade. It's something we all know. It's something we acknowledge professionally in our conferences. It's something we talk about while we're having a cup of coffee with our friends and colleagues. But it also is something that isn't always easy to navigate concretely when we're in a classroom or when we're sitting around an IEP table, and especially, I would say, when it comes to decisions about how we're going to fund assistive technology, because though none of us wish for the past, we'll be having a short discussion today about how much assistive technology used to be a little easier to identify, to describe in terms of its functional characteristics as they relate to the people that we work with, and how much our funding environment has really come out of that. And it looks like a whole bunch of people can't hear me, so I am going to try to do something here. Make sure that you can hear me. I'm seeing yeses now. Did everybody just miss the last 3 minutes of my typing? Good audio? Yes? Okay. More of you are hearing me than not, so remember to make sure that your speakers are plugged in and that you're allowing your computer to stream the audio if it's not coming through. Okay. Anyway, what I was talking about was that our assistive technology has changed, and it means the definitions have changed around what can be funded, and the onus is on us to continue to educate our funders, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today as we talk about how we get this stuff funded in an educational environment. So I know that, I would hope that we've all seen this before. It has been waved as a flag in front of many different presentations that I've sat listening to and watching, and it's a beautiful statement, but I'm going to propose that it's becoming dated, and I think that's why it's important. This was written in 1991, or at least it was quoted. For people without disabilities, technology makes life things easier. For people with disabilities, technology makes things possible. So if we come out of 1991 and move toward 2017, by the way, I'm not suggesting that this funny little picture here has anything to do with assistive technology. I just think it's a nice little photo of how we conceptualize where we are as humans. But we fast forward to 2017, and we think differently now about technology because technology isn't reserved for specific aspects of our lives. If we are a person who would be characterized as able-bodied compared to a person who we might label as disabled. So now we can see that technology is all around us. It's not just solely for people with special needs. And I'm saying assistive technology is not solely for people with special needs. Assistive technology facilitates learning for every student. And in fact, let's just forget the assistive part at times and just say that technology facilitates learning for every student. We are finally, I would say, beginning to digest and weave into what we do principles of universal design, not just because we've all believed it for 20 years, but because commercial technology is forcing us to use technology that way, and it's a really good thing. As I intimated earlier, however, that's the way we all address our clients, our students, the people that we advocate for. And yet, a lot of funding policy, which was heroically written in some cases 20 years ago and advocated for, now has become difficult to wrap around how we use technology in a classroom for a student. So part of our job is to take a little bit of ownership of that and continue to advocate not only locally as we figure out how, but also to continue, obviously, to work at a policy level to change that. So I've listed out here 2 minds of 18. I think, again, I'm just trying to hammer this point over the head because it's so important. When we look at funders, I'm talking about traditional funders for now, although I'll add a footnote that I think there are a lot of what we would call alternative funders, meaning private foundations, local nonprofits, who also subscribe to fairly rigid ideas of what constitutes assistive technology. So funder definitions: it must serve a specific disability, presumes medical necessity, it needs to be durable, must not be useful in the absence of a particular injury or a labeled disability, and must be specifically configured equipment. In other words, was it built in someone's garage or was it built at a factory specifically for the purpose of assistive technology? And let's think then of those definitions as they compare to how we all think of the practical definition of what we're trying to accomplish with technology, which means we're finding independence, we're enabling participation, physical access, alternatives to learning, and augmented communication and language development. That's not an exhaustive list. They're just examples. But my point is, when we look at that list, think about in a general ed classroom, how much of the very same definitions could be applied to every student sitting in that desk, and how this might cause a little bit of stress for a funder as they think about the equipment that's being used and why they're having trouble funding it. So one of the things I've done when I have discussed this particular issue in Washington, D.C. with our friends at Medicare and with other state level and regional policymakers is I say, we have to remember that if we're watching a movie, it's not a movie because there is a projector with film running in front of a lens that's projecting that onto a screen somewhere. A movie is sitting in front of any streaming computer-based service now, be it Netflix or Amazon or whatever. My point being that we get stuck in defining what things are by how they've been made in the past and how we've used them in the past, and we forget that it's the functional definition that matters most. Feel free to use that when you're talking to funders, by the way, anytime. So here's a quote that I just can't help but include in as many places as possible. This is just out of the horse's mouth. We can't fund an iPad for a student with a disability because, well, everyone has an iPad, and, well, you can get one at Best Buy. Direct quote. And doesn't that just illustrate the point? So it's not looking at the function of the tool. It's having trouble wrapping our head around what that tool is doing for that person. I spent a lot of time a couple of years ago talking to funders all around the country about funding iPads used in SPED classrooms around the country. And what I kept hearing was that they knew what to call the tool, and because they knew it had a name, and Apple was on the back of it, and it was called an iPad, that they were just stumbling over what to do with it. Whereas if I come to them and I said, well, here is an assistive technology tool. It's called a flapjacker, and this flapjacker is going to enable this child to use this thing called an app that allows them to participate in the classroom with a switch and answer the teacher's questions because they are nonverbal or whatever condition it is that enables them to participate because they wouldn't otherwise. And they say, oh, well, then we definitely need to start funding those flapjackers. But the problem was they knew to call it an iPad, and they couldn't figure out what to do with it. So part of this language issue is literally the words we use. And isn't it funny, not ha-ha, but that IDEA told us as recently as 2008 that really assistive technology is any item, piece of equipment, or product system required commercially or off-the-shelf, modified, or customized that's used to increase, maintain, or improve the functional capability of a child with a disability. They've got it right. We just need to know how to advocate and make it work for a funded system. All right, so I'm going to move through some of the categories of AT to just make sure we're all on the same page before I leap into some of the different funding mechanisms. And mainly I do this because, again, when we think about bouncing between how we describe assistive technology in very narrow terms, functionally for a student, knowing that sometimes the equipment we're using to get to those functional goals is maybe more commercially allocated generally in the population, or is it repurposed this or that, or maybe it's something very specific, like a finger support for someone working on fine motor goals. But being aware of how we're thinking about the functional utility of the tool and then how that translates to a funder. So at any rate, these assistive technology categories, again, not exhaustive, but a lot of the categories that we work with for ADLs, assistive listening, environmental control, speech-generating devices, seating and positioning, alternative access, adapted educational materials, and again, which student in the classroom now does not use what we used to call adapted educational materials and is now just the way we learn, or obviously orthotics and prosthetics. And I think the challenge here, again, is looking at how we characterize these things. So AT assists with all of these great goals that we're all in this field to accomplish, which is provide physical interaction with the environment, decrease the receptive expressive divide. We see this so often in classrooms with communication. Peer performance, where we're attempting to not just achieve peer relational performance, but engage with peers, even if there's a disparate notion of actual performance, the engagement with a peer because they're using a similar tool or they're able to share in an activity, we get that peer performance, independence, participation, of course, which I think is an overarching goal of all assistive technology, future vocational potential. This is a really massive goal for all of us. And when I talk about assistive technology for transition and funding into transition, this is something that I concentrate on, obviously, big time, that starts early, where we want to be thinking ahead, even before the age of 14, thinking ahead to where this person might contribute to society using a variety of assistive technologies as appropriate. Concentration, endurance, and obviously social interaction, which I would say participation and social interaction are the scaffolding for all of these other things. So again, briefly, not an exhaustive list, but this is a list that I think fits into that bucket of tools, sort of the old school tools. We still use them all the time, incidentally, but I think this is, again, how we might conceptualize traditional assistive technology, e-readers, and adapted seating, eye control, speech recognition, all this stuff, braillers, arm supports, headsets, mobile tablets. And this huge array of software-based solutions that everyone is using across educational goals, and that has so much to do with how people participate in learning and sharing information now. So to sort of close this topic before we launch into mechanisms for funding, you know, I asked the question, why changes in definition of assistive technology matter? Well, I started out with this question, and I think the important thing is that we have for a long time thought that if it wasn't made with a glue gun, then it must not be real assistive technology. Now, by the way, we should still be using glue guns, and I would hope that all of us still do to make what we need. But this notion that we make them specially for special people with special needs, which in some ways, from a funding standpoint, makes them very easy to identify and categorize. Fits very nicely into these little buckets and pockets that we can then carry forward and say, oh, look, it's right here, and it's worth this much, and it's going to be used in exactly this way. And I'm going to talk about how we can hopefully achieve the same thing, talking about functional goals later with funding. But you might be wondering what that photo is, by the way. The photo is actually kind of an interesting tool. I put it on there as an example because that is something called a Spica pump. And fortunately, it's not something that a human would use on their own body. It's for an Alfa Romeo car. And it's this thing that was made to try to bring us out of the age of carburetors into a very primitive notion of fuel injection. I'm using that as an example not because we're going to sit down with click and clack and have car talk here. I wanted to use it as an example because it is a specific tool that was made for something that everybody at the time saw and thought, oh, this is great. You just got to take those Weber carburetors off the side of the engine, you know, throw this thing on, and now it's going to take fuel and inject it right into the engine, and everything's going to be great, and it's the future, and that's how we've looked at assistive technology. So again, I'm hoping that I've hammered this over the head enough that you feel bludgeoned, but that's really what I want to accomplish with this. Someone was asking if we're going to touch a little more on transitional assistive technology needs as we will to in the future webcast. It's not built into this presentation today. And that is a whole entire webinar of its own, and I'd be happy to do that at some point if people wanted to hear about it. So we have these blurring lines of technology everywhere in the gen ed environment that we all use and we're all very familiar with, and that sometimes pollute the judgment that we take to the need for funding. And as I say at the end here, because so many benefit from a technology, funders need a little guidance because they can easily get confused. All right, so when we look at funding assistive technology in schools, it's really important to think, as we do hopefully about a lot of the work we do, which is that it's a systems approach. And it's not just a systems approach in terms of knowing the system or systems that are available for funding, but also understanding that it's very much a part of the system itself that we construct in our local environment around that child needs to involve a lot of different moving parts. We need to know By the way, this all is presuming that when we're looking at funding assistive technology, we are going to be organized. Very scary term for a lot of us, but it really is important to think up front. From the first time we think about the assistive technology implementation process and about funding in particular, that we start deciding how notes are going to be kept, who's going to keep them, and other levels of organization that I'll talk about later. I have a slide that goes through some of that. And the reason is because we could be talking about changes across the lifespan, not just in performance on the part of that student, but changes across the lifespan and what that person has available to them from a funding standpoint. Funding itself is going to vary by environment, and as I talk about some of the different funding mechanisms, I will note that some of them are far more approachable in certain environments, far more successful in certain environments than others. They vary by student disabilities. And though none of us appreciate the labels that we are stuck with using, they speak to funders because, again, when I'm talking earlier about categorization and fitting people into buckets, which, again, sounds terrible on the surface, is something that funders rely on at times for classification purposes. And that can sometimes change across a student's career, K through 12 even. These could be local or regional or national resources. We're going to talk about everything from Medicare down to regional resources, state and local, as well as private funding sources. And importantly, I'd like to note that they are often combined. In fact, we've done a tremendous amount of funding work the last 4 or 5 years now in my professional circle, and it's hard to count the times when it is not coming from a combined resource. And by the way, I'm talking not just about multiple items. Obviously, different, especially a person who has high assistive technology needs, they might have a constellation of funding opportunities for the array of tools that they're using, but I'm talking even within a single item. Then right in line with that, it may cover only a portion of the total cost, and it's important to know up front that it is very possible that even with combined resources, only a portion of the total cost is going to be covered. Those of you who are a little longer in the tooth, as am I these days, but not ridiculously longer in the tooth, but life marches on. May remember some of the page turners of years gone by, and page turners pre-digital publishing used to be this kind of gangly, awkward-looking mechanism, rollers and little sticky pieces of gum that would launch across and hopefully target a page and grab onto it and pull it over. And they were fabulously expensive. There were about 4 or 5 manufacturers in the world that made these things, and God, they were a ball to watch at conferences because they worked about 18% of the time really well, and about half the time they worked okay, and then the rest of the time you were either putting more sticky stuff on them to make them work, or they just flat didn't, and you would end up with a wrinkled book or magazine, kind of shoved into the corner of the device. But my point in bringing them up as an example is that you have this $3,000 or $5,000 page turner, right? Just so this person can sit and do the thing that we all want to do, which is to read. And yet, who's going to cover that, right? It's not something that allows them to. You're stuck with using either private money or a benefactor of some kind or a local organization who might come in and pay for a portion of that. They might have an old broken loaner laying around that they don't have the money to fix it. My point using the example is this is the world of assistive technology. We're always kind of bringing to bear a lot of different resources. I would challenge us all to find the fun in that. And I mean that. I think that part of our job, because we don't live in a perfect world, because we don't live in a country that devotes significant amounts of resources to providing tools for people with disabilities, kind of carte blanche. Our work, a big part of our work, is to not just advocate for funding for people, but to recognize that there just isn't always adequate funding. And so part of what we do then is we become kind of the MacGyvers of the situation in terms of pulling together all the resources and making something work for them. So I want to challenge us all that actually can be fun, and that it's important to pull ourselves up from our bootstraps every once in a while when we get a little depressed and say, no, actually, this is my work. My work is to make this happen for this person. And then the last item I just want to mention here, of course, is that we do have trouble covering training, and I'll say outside school funding. So SPED programs typically offer at least the opportunity for training, and that is kind of built into a lot of that funding. We don't always get that privilege in other funded environments. So there's lots of different ways we can talk about funding. I've decided to kind of break it up for purposes of discussion in terms of different funding mechanisms. And then we can kind of break each of those down. And I've got some case examples at the end that I'm hoping will highlight how they might work for certain types of kids. But as we think this through, and again, not an exhaustive list, different ways to do this, but one way is to think in terms of just school-based funding, what I'm lumping into as regional, which, by the way, might also be school-affiliated, or possibly is a regional education district, or maybe is a regional organization that is a tech organization, state Medicaid, federal funding, which for the population we're talking about today is limited. I mean, unless you lump Medicaid dollars into that, which we could, but I think that's sort of splitting hairs. If we think of Medicaid as different, but federal funding in its traditional sense is very, very rarely available, with the exception of TRICARE, and I'll talk about TRICARE, which is the military insurance. Private insurance, which I find is not frequently used enough, in my opinion, in K-12. People forget. I think there's a tendency to say, well, this is a special ed departmental funding obligation, and I'm going to stick with that, and we're going to get legal involved. We're just going to take it as far as we go, forgetting that there is a possibility, again, the sort of MacGyvers, if you will, and maybe that's not the best term, but with the resource puller togetherers, which is what so much of our job is, we can be looking around and help steer and advise the families that we're working with to look at other places too, and to not get hung up on the fact that maybe there is resistance in one area and we're forgetting to look somewhere else. So I say that because I think oftentimes private insurance, which in some cases, with the exception of Cigna, has more flexibility than you think for products that you wouldn't traditionally think of them as funding. Diagnosis-specific foundations, we'll talk about some of those, and then alternative funding, which again is really reaching into your community, and lots of communities have very rich resources that hardly get discovered because we get so distracted thinking of more traditional funders. So I've used this little circular pattern from PowerPoint to put this here because it really does, we really need to remember as we're sitting in those meetings, as we're beginning to get frustrated because we've been denied coverage for an item from one source, that it is possible to look other places. And the deeper we dig, oftentimes the more we uncover. Use your colleagues, use other people who've gone through the system before you. Okay, so school-based funding, when we think about, well, again, what I'm going to loosely lump into what I'm going to call school-based funding, we have early intervention as programs, okay? And so these are very differently prescribed, if you will, in different states and different regions. So I'm not going to get into some of the gory details, but I'm putting these as in general terms, early intervention. If a child has an IFSP or is part of an SR program, they're opening up to some funding. There's IDEA, which is really SPED funding if a person qualifies and has an IEP with assistive technology goals written into it. Section 504, which in some districts is just fabulously used to help fund assistive technology for kids who don't necessarily qualify by disability to be on an IEP, or many even do, but they're not. I mean, could technically, but they are not because the team or the parents, everybody's really figured that they're just not on that IEP. But 504 is a vehicle for funding for that student. District technology funding and program-specific funding. So a lot of these program and district technology funding mechanisms, again, vary wildly by state. There are states that have been very reactive. I'm going to use California as an example to constricted state funding flowing into technology for students overall. And so districts have taken it upon themselves, sometimes with benefactors in mind, sometimes because they decided to allocate their resources that way, where they are willing to fund technology through the district in a way that is program specific or that comes straight out of the district in kind of a banked system for students that is that allows them to get some very diverse technology funded that probably even the Medicaid would not fund. So when we look at special ed funding, we know that the student needs to qualify for special services, and I'm appreciating these comments instantly. I'm taking a time out here to read as you're writing, and I love the fact that people are putting in these comments about what I'm saying. So keep doing that. Students qualify for special services when they need the IEP to provide that rationale and roadmap for AT. That's a big part of our work. Part of this, of course, means that handle their assistive technology is going to determine what that student can do with it. They obviously, as any SPED program is going to want to do, their primary goal is to make sure that they are opening up the world of education to that student and providing the least restrictive learning environment. But that doesn't always translate into that technology going home with that student, even though as clinicians and as people who advocate for total participation for people with disabilities, we would like to see them using that technology everywhere. So we just need to be aware that that is something that may or may not exist. And then I think also, we're not talking about transition in any detail, but one of the biggest points in a student's life is when they're either aging out or graduating out of school, and they leave behind this huge cupboard of technology that has really enabled them to participate in ways that they're unable to carry forward because it literally stays at school. So just things to keep in mind as we think through this level of funding. When we look at our tech programs and our telephone access programs, by the way, tech access programs, there's one funded in virtually every state and territory. The degree to which they are able to provide assistive technology varies by state. Many of them are really an evaluation center and provide information and resources. Others have a very robust capacity to both recommend and even assist with third-party funding for assistive technology. Telephone access programs exist in about 28 states or so, and these are programs that are funded by the local utility. Each telephone that's purchased, there's a portion of it that goes into a mandatory pot for the state, and they fund adapted equipment for people who need access to the telephone. Used to serve primarily folks with hearing impairment, and now in many states is broadened to include other speech technology, and even in some states more than that. So this is something that wherever you're, whatever state you're coming from, look to see if they're part of a telephone access program. Different states have different names for them. In Oregon, it's TDAP. In Texas, it's called STAP, but it's telephone access, and there are lists that you'll find with a quick Google that will tell you exactly whether or not your state participates. University-based grant-funded AT programs. And again, I think the key here is that sussing out up front who's going to own that equipment, what kind of training and support is going to be provided, and whether or not it is a loan, as they say, versus owned, or strictly an evaluation tool. State Medicaids are hugely variable, and I think the important thing to note here is that state Medicaids subscribe to the specific definitions of funded assistive technology that I was alluding to earlier. So they're usually, with the exclusion of a few of our more, I would say, assistive technology-based progressive states like Colorado and Minnesota as examples, who have assistive technology funding programs that look quite seriously at commercially available technology. And there are others that are going to follow instead. And what I'm really talking about here in specific is an iPad. So, and not just iPads, by the way, but I'm using it as an example, as a specific example. So there are programs funded by state Medicaid, sort of a subsidiary program in the state of Colorado, for instance, that will fund an iPad and an app on it. In other words, they don't only fund equipment that could be maybe used as or qualified as durable medical equipment, right? Which is a very restrictive definition of some types of assistive technology. The key, though, with state Medicaid is that they're all different. They all have different rules and regulations. Some follow Medicare, some do not. There is a rigorous application process in some states. In Washington, requires video to prove that the technology is appropriate because they just do, and so that becomes a stumbling block for many people. Compensation is variable. There are states that fund AT at 30 or 40 or 50% of what the manufacturer has set as a price. There are other states that will fund it 80 or 100%. And the thing to note is that if the state doesn't pay very much for something, it's possible that that technology is not going to be available, even if you've done the full evaluation and you think that it's the best thing in the world for your student. One advantage of that for Medicaid, almost all the time and almost for all states, if it's funded, the student owns that equipment. Federal funding, just to note that obviously Medicare is not something that is going to be very relevant for most K-12. It is important to know that Medicare in this country pretty much defines it gives a lot of structure around how we think of assistive technology that is then used by the state and by many third-party payers, not by our special ed programmatics, not typically by a lot of regional foundations. But when we're talking about private insurance, as I did earlier, and here I was, saying, we should use private insurance more often. Again, it takes that upfront research to know whether or not that private insurer subscribes to the definition set by Medicare or Medicaid, because that could be hugely restrictive. TRICARE is the one I wanted to mention, though. TRICARE is a military insurer based on Medicare's definitions of things. So you got to take that large grain of salt up front. But they do fund reliably for kids who are the kids of serving military personnel. And sometimes they will just rent equipment, but oftentimes they will pay for it outright, and the student then would own that. And the good thing about our military families is that for them is that because they're often moving so much, we can get something funded fairly quickly and reliably if they're, say, based in San Diego for a time, and then they're moving to some other part of the world or some other place in the United States. They can take that equipment with them and be using it, hopefully, functionally as they go around. So it lessens the barrier there. And question about insurance, yes, I'm talking about private health insurance. And yes, there is at times cost to the family for sure, and it depends on, it's actually beholden to, well, okay, so manufacturers that make stuff that then gets funded, whether it is commercially based, and some private insurers can be convinced to purchase, and that, by the way, much more so in the last 4 years than ever before. They will look at the equipment that is technology based, but when it's described as being functionally useful to that student in very concrete terms out in the world, they are surprisingly at times willing to fund that. But there, of course, is going to likely be a copay associated with that. It is not legal for manufacturers who agree to have their equipment funded to waive that copay. It can be done in certain circumstances. It cannot be a common practice to do that. And so that's very frustrating. It's frustrating for companies because they would like to do it more, and it's frustrating for people who are privately insured because they're stuck with coming up with another 20% on what might be a very expensive piece of equipment or more. But it's one of those just sort of nasty realities that it's not possible to waive that. So that's a really important point. And as part of that, every policy is different. There are literally hundreds of thousands of policies across the United States for private insurance. Different insurers have very different attitudes toward assistive technology, like I just said. Cigna, and I hope, if anybody works for Cigna, no personal offense, they're very difficult to work with when it comes to, as a general rule, and it's just a policy decision. Maybe we shouldn't hold it against them. It's just something that they're not known for working with easily, and so I'm using them as an example that way. Cigna, just as a blanket policy, does not fund AT well, and they tend to really fight if you come after them from an advocacy and legal standpoint to get it funded, even in some very clear-cut cases. And the way some companies get around that is that they'll have policy exclusions written in very tiny font. I wear glasses, but, I need a microscope for some of these policies when it comes to actually reading the fine print. But that would be after I took about 13 naps, because, of course, reading an insurance policy is probably one of the least stimulating things you can do in your entire life. But regardless, you get down to the fine print, and it'll say somewhere in there that, various types of assistive technology, which will be qualified and classified by them, are disqualified from any type of funding. And that's why, when we work for a company or if we work for an agency and they're providing insurance on our behalf, they're buying a plan, and it's not, they haven't read the fine print probably either. They're looking for the best deal that covers as many employees as possible. And it's up to the insurance companies to write this stuff creatively so that they cut certain aspects of it out. But again, I reveal my bias. But at the same time, I just want to make sure people are aware they need to find that out ahead of time. The easiest way to do it is to call with your policy number. And when I've worked in a funding capacity, and I did until very recently, work very actively in a funding business, what we did is we would get people's information and immediately call the insurer. The family can do it too. They don't often have the time, nor do they always have the skills. And sometimes it's just the skill of confidence to know that you need to call and find out. But again, we take this on as part of our role as providers, and we would call and just ask, and then you have to follow the bouncing ball. It is true, incidentally, Jill is mentioning that parents not only give permission, but do a lot of legwork for utilizing private insurance. Usually, the legwork is, there's two ways to go about it. One is, yes, they may indeed be asked to make those phone calls and chase down specifics in the policy. Or they can provide the front and back of their insurance card to an advocate or to hopefully the person who would be processing their funding and say, I would like to find out if I am eligible or if my son or daughter is eligible for this with insurance. And that usually can be answered. The caveat there is that there are insurers who will say, you know what, we do every one of these as a one-off, and we're not going to pass judgment until we see it, so send it in. And then we'll let you know whether or not we're going to fund it. Oh, and we're also going to let you know at that time how much we're going to pay for it. That is not uncommon, and so that is part of the risk of private insurance. However, I would say, again, it's a risk worth taking in many cases. So, and incidentally, when I talk about private insurance also, again, this is also the time to think broadly about how we're approaching, why we're approaching funding for this kiddo. So, and what I mean by that is that we're either going to work within the district funding mechanism and fight for that as being the only way we're going to get things funded. And I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying that there are also risks associated with that. First of all, the district might not have the financial capacity, especially in some rural districts that I've worked with over the years. There just is. I had principals call and say, when I was working clinically, and say, please don't put that report in. We don't have our budget. We can probably do it next year, but this year we've got 2 power wheelchairs to pay for, and we're blowing our budget. With offline conversations, by the way, and what a sad state to be in. But I guess importantly is that the district might not have the capacity to fund that thing, and so might say, well, this isn't our job right now. Or also keeping in mind that it could be that the district's going to own that piece of equipment, kids can't take it where they would want to. Reaching out to private insurance might mean justifying its use in somewhere other than exclusively an educational environment, but that should be easy because I can hardly ever think of times when the assistive technology that we use for educational purposes is not appropriate outside of the classroom. It's hard to think of many circumstances creatively where that would be the case. So I think we can often make a compelling argument to private insurers that this isn't a strictly educational-based tool. It has to do with the quality of life of this individual in some very big ways. Okay, so there are more and more companies, private insurers, who are seeing the value of adaptive commercial equipment, and I think that's important. In fact, more and more we are seeing private insurers saying, well, we would like an ideal primarily in the world of augmented communication, so I'm going to use an example here, where they'll say, well, we're not interested in paying, $6,000 for this machine when we could get a tablet and we'll pay for the software on it, and it's going to cost us a lot less. I like that. I really think that's important for us, as long as we don't lose the support side of things. So this is a conversation I have with many of my colleagues, which is that we don't want to lose funding for support, which is partly what we pay for when we pay for assistive technology, and it seems expensive. But at the same time, as part of this revolution of consumer equipment, we want to encourage our funders to think creatively too, because that's going to force us to look at how we support these things differently. Anyway, it's a whole other conversation that I don't want to get too far into. But foundation funding, usually disability specific. These are excellent ways to get tertiary funding. It's not always enough for primary or secondary. A lot of times it's a way to get a loan of equipment, but very, very good resources. And what I'm calling alternative funding, which has to do with looking around us. And again, the challenge I had at the very beginning of this talk about thinking of our role as being one that looks positively around and says, what are all the different connections that I have professionally? In fact, a big part of our work is to stay connected to our local community so that we can connect our clients and our students with other resources too. So local chapters and organizations, local benefactors, people that are having fundraisers or nonprofit foundations in the local area. And we can even, depending on how much gumption we have, assist with those local private funding events. Some of us have that time and many of us don't. I'm not saying we should have that time. I'm just saying that these are options and that when we're connected, that they are there in many communities. John just mentioned something about in California with ability tools. That's an excellent resource. So I've got a couple case examples I want to get to in our closing minutes, but before that I want to make sure I mention a couple of funding tips. Again, I've said this a few times already, but what I have found in my experience is that when families and professionals know all of their funding options up front and agree that they are all valid and that there isn't a bad attitude about one or negativity associated with another, but that the job that we are taking on by being in our professional milieu or that has been foisted upon us as a parent or as a teacher is that a big part of our job is to look out into the world positively what all of those options are and be willing to engage with all of them. But that part of that means we do a little bit of that research or we inspire the people we're working with to do the research on finding out, well, what is the funding option with this private insurer? What is the special education department willing to bring to the table if this ends up as part of the IEP? Is it going to be the thing we really want? Can we walk around with it outside of the school? Will it follow this person through transition, et cetera, et cetera? Maybe that's the only option, and that's as good as we're going to get for now. But in the meantime, we're going to look at other options, too, that would either be longer term or we're going to start a little account that we're saving for or whatever it is that is going to be a real forward-thinking plan. Keeping well-organized notes. It sounds ridiculous, but it's so true. Finding competent evaluators. Assistive technology is a very underserved professional area. There's huge need and very few experts, but there are a lot more people that know a lot more about it now than there used to be. I think the real advantage we have, again, is how has how has the funding environment changed in the last 15 years? Well, part of that is that we all know a lot more about technology than we used to. I remember way, way back, in 2007 or 8 when iPads came around, and no one understood how to use an app or what an app was, and we were all scared and shaking in our boots. And now it would be difficult to find someone who would be intimidated if you were handed an iPad or an Android device and said, well, figure out how to change the screen on this so that we can use this reading program or this digital book. So we don't have a lot of competent evaluator specialists, but we have a lot more general knowledge about technology in general and how we all use it. And then being realistic. There are few funders who fund 100% of anything, and I would even stretch that to mean there are few funding environments in which you might get 100% of what that student really needs. And so we need to have that comprehensive view. We need to be thinking about alternatives and how we're going to close the gaps to funding for this stuff. I do want to spend just the last closing minutes on a couple of case studies. I think it helps illustrate the point. This first case study is a person, Amy, diagnosed with pervasive developmental delay, nonverbal communication, self-injurious behaviors in an inclusion classroom on an IEP, which includes communication support, sensory regulation, fine motor, and behavior modification goals. And what we have is a situation where there's been a trial of an iPad and communication app. It has resulted in positive communication and behavioral improvements. And the evaluation team that was bringing this in, and they're part of a more of a regional service district coming in, sort of, swooping in, parachuting, helicoptering, whatever you want to call it, in to make recommendations, has made this recommendation for an iPad and a specific app to address this little girl's needs. So they're thinking, well, it would be great to have this thing as something that the kid owns. We're going to save a little bit of budget. We're going to write the funding request and submit it to Medicaid. And it's denied. And so the question is, why? Well, in most states, and we're just going to take the, we'll exclude the few now that have specific codes for iPads and educational apps or communication apps or whatever it happens to be. It doesn't, in this particular state, qualify for Medicaid coverage because Medicaid, in this particular situation, only covers a speech-generating device. And after all, it's an iPad with a communication app, so it can't be a speech-generating device, even though every speech-generating device since 1999 or earlier has been a tablet computer with software on it, but we haven't known the name of what the tablet is, and it might have a fancy box around it. But anyway, it doesn't qualify because it's not a speech-generating device. So what is going to happen? Well, the team in this case should proceed by saying, well, we are going to find a company like AbleNet or Forbes Rehab Solutions or one of the other many companies that Talk to Me Technologies in the United States that builds communication devices using an iPad as the tablet. And we're going to resubmit our funding request as a speech-generating device. And in that case, in all likelihood, it would be successful. So this next one is a case study. Little guy by the name of Mike, 14 years old, Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. Just like so many of these little kiddos, I guess 14 isn't a little kiddo anymore, but getting weakness toward the end of the day. Not on an IEP, but does have issues with fine motor and vocalization. Very common. This is a very common situation for students that I've seen. So certainly could benefit from voice amplification, text input, voice recognition software, adapted reading material. It might only be used for the last few hours of the day, but that's okay. It's extremely important to keep this person participating and take the stress out of the front part of the day of, oh my goodness, I'm not going to be able to do this in a few hours because I'm going to be too tired. So in this situation, we might look to a 504 plan team to get involved so that we can get this guy the technology needed. And it would be very surprising to me in any educational setting that a 504 plan would not cover this type of technology. Importantly, though, we want to involve the student, family, peers, paraprofessionals, if necessary, and make sure that there is that team environment that I emphasized earlier. But importantly, I guess my point is that it's not a matter of reaching out and saying, oh, we need to convince the private insurer or Medicaid to pay for this stuff. What we really can look for is an internal mechanism that will cover. And then finally, this 9-year-old with autism, echolalic, limited array of two-step commands, and requests using text and visual supports, iPad apps for time management, scheduling, communication, choice making, adaptive desk and share, and one-to-one paraprofessional. IEP calls for multiple assistive technology supports to accommodate this person. And here's where there's enough going on that we have the opportunity to be that hub of connectivity to which I referred earlier. We look at different types of resources. What does the tech program have available? Obviously, it's written in the IEP, so we're going to be working through that mechanism. But just because it's in the IEP doesn't mean we have to fund it all for the school. Part of the law dictates that the school makes available the resources to acquire the appropriate technology for the student to reduce those barriers. And that can also mean looking at funding outside the district itself. And in fact, it is possible for that school-based evaluation team to write the report and make those recommendations and not have to do it on their own time outside of school hours because it happens to be going to a private insurer. We're using the school resources to make the appropriate recommendations to acquire the appropriate equipment for that student. So my point here, and I know that we're out of time, but just I want to make sure that you realize this is a constellation of resources and bringing to bear all those different resources to dispatch the technology for the student. So, okay. And we are at the top of the hour. Are there other questions or comments that I can help answer? 504 funding. What funding resources given for 504 in our county all falls into IEP? Well, okay, so it does at times fall under the same SPED funding umbrella. It's a different way of getting into that funding mechanism. So it's really the entree into that funding bucket that 504 gets in some districts. Others set aside money for that. And I see that there is a link to the feedback. I will thank you all in advance for taking that survey, and I want to thank all of you for being available today and sharing in this topic.